Hey everybody, Tom Vieira here, and this is the Think and Read podcast. How do we know that we know something, truly know something? Not just by Googling it or using AI, but knowing something in a way that is sturdy and reliable. How do we know that we're not being deceived somehow? We remember Michel de Montaigne as a skeptic. That is, as somebody who doesn't think you can really know something, but what exactly does that mean? In this episode, we'll take up some of the background on skepticism. How did it start? And how does this help us to better understand Montaigne's own skepticism? I hope you enjoyed this episode. And if you want to find more episodes, please find the Think and Read podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and on YouTube. And don't forget to subscribe. Thanks so much. In the 1570s, Montaigne encountered an ancient skeptic by the name of Sextus Empiricus. Now, Sextus Empiricus was the most important of all the ancient skeptics. He was not the first. He actually was living a couple hundred years into the Roman Empire, long after other skeptics like Pyrrho had come around. Socrates, if you want to think of Socrates as a skeptic. But Sextus Empiricus was the most important. Now, in this episode, what I want to do is take up a couple of questions. Number one, why was Montaigne reading Sextus Empiricus at this point? Montaigne had come home, withdrew from society, and began to write his essays. And his most philosophically, anyway, his most well-known essay is his apology for Raymond Sebon. And I'm going to actually look at that essay more up close in the next episode. But what I want to do in this episode is get a context for it. We need to understand a couple of things. And one of those things is, why is Montaigne reading this great ancient skeptic, Sextus Empiricus, which would kind of be the background for his defense of skepticism in the Apology. Okay, and the second thing that I want to do is I want to take up an introduction to skepticism. Some of you may have heard of skepticism, but you may not be very familiar with what exactly it is. And that's a really important question, right? What is philosophical skepticism is what I'm going to call it. Where did it come from? What exactly are skeptics saying? And there's a story to tell about that. So that'll be the main focus in the first part of this episode before we return back to Montaigne and why he was reading Sextus Empiricus. So first, let's distinguish between what we can call philosophical skepticism and, let's say, popular skepticism or cultural skepticism. It may be that you might know somebody who could be described as skeptical. They struggle to trust authority, let's say. They are always wanting to ask questions, and they maybe don't have a lot of answers. Maybe they're agnostic with respect to God, for example. So this person might be a philosophical skeptic, but not necessarily, right? Just to have a disposition or an attitude toward common beliefs about things, common narratives, is not necessarily to be a philosophical skeptic. You might doubt those things and still think that knowledge is possible. So that's a clue to what philosophical skepticism is. So in a very broad sense, philosophical skeptics take a position. Okay, and that in itself is going to be a matter of some dispute, what that position looks like, or what does it mean to live a skeptical life. But they make a commitment with respect to knowledge. So it's an epistemological commitment. And the commitment broadly is that knowledge in the justified true belief sense, the sense that Plato sought for knowledge and Aristotle sought for knowledge. It's kind of broad idea of knowledge, at least classically understood. We see it with the Stoics, we see it with the Epicureans, right? This idea that you can have a belief that is true, and so long as you can justify it, give enough good reasons for it, we can call that knowledge. And the belief in that is that it's possible to give enough reasons. Right? It's reasonable to believe that there's such a thing as knowledge. Well, the skeptics doubt that. Okay, in one form or another, the skeptics, as a school of thought, doubt that you can reach that place of justified true belief. Okay, but how did it start? And that's where I want to begin. I want to begin with where skepticism began. And the really interesting thing, the surprising thing, at least to me, when I first encountered this, was that it began in Plato's academy. Okay, so Plato famously set up his school, his academy, in 387 BC, and that's roughly 12 years after Socrates was executed. That has a story in and of itself, and for Montaigne anyway, he would look to Socrates as sort of the ideal skeptic. Socrates is, in some sense, the ideal figure when it comes at least to our right attitude toward knowledge. Okay, Socrates, in Montaigne's remembrance of him, is somebody who had a lot of questions and not a lot of answers. Socrates is the one who famously said things like, "The only thing I know is that I don't know." Now, as a side note, scholars of ancient philosophy debate this, right? They debate who's the true Socrates, because it looks like in some of Plato's dialogues, that's how we know Socrates mainly, is through what Plato gives to us in his dialogue. Socrates is mentioned in other texts, but Plato is our main source. In certain texts, it looks like, for example, in the Euthyphro, it looks like Socrates is not really wanting to take any kind of stand on a matter. In that dialogue, it's a matter of piety. What does it mean to be pious? And he and Euthyphro kind of go around on that for a little bit. And Socrates is more asking questions. And this is the Socrates that we think of with the Socratic method. The term that's used philosophically is elenchus. It's this idea of question and answer, sort of like a cross-examination. That Socrates is particularly attractive to Montaigne. But in any case, Plato, Socrates' most important and most well-known student, of course, did believe that you can know. He did believe that you can have justified true beliefs. And so as you read Plato's dialogues, this sort of interpretation anyway of his dialogues sort of sees them as sort of progressing over time, right? Like there are these so-called early dialogues of Plato where Socrates is the historic Socrates, and that's the skeptic. And then eventually you start getting these dialogues where Socrates looks like he wants to defend positions and not just question them. And so we kind of think of those as sort of the middle, and sometimes you have these late dialogues where it's questionable whether it has anything to do with Socrates at all. So I'm going to sidestep that whole debate among scholars today and get right to how skepticism came about. In Plato's academy, you have these philosophers meeting outside the city walls of Athens. They actually met in some grove, sacred grove of Athena. And they're pursuing dialogue, right? They're pursuing the philosophical approach of dialectic, conversation, as the means by which we are going to access that which is true. Now, it's interesting that Aristotle was one of the students in the academy. He was in the academy from about the middle, somewhere in the middle of the 360s until the 340s. So about 20 years he was in the academy, and he ended up leaving. And I think that's important that Aristotle went and started his own school and did not continue in the academy. And his school was known literally as the walking school, the peripatetic school, and it was named the Lyceum. And in Aristotle's school, they're called the walking school because they would, instead of being in a single place, having conversation, using reason, an argument, dialectic to get at what's true, which is more Platonic, Aristotle wanted to get out into the world. He stressed careful study and observation. There's more of an empirical emphasis with Aristotle. Okay, so I'm going to put Aristotle aside. I mentioned him just to kind of provide a little context for what was happening in Plato's academy. Okay, so eventually in the academy, the predominant view became something like this: knowledge in principle is not possible. Okay, now I want to go to Sextus Empiricus, who doesn't come around again for a few hundred years, but in the beginning of his work, Outlines of Pyrrhonism, and I'll talk about that term Pyrrhonism in just a little bit. It's the type of skepticism, Pyrrhonian skepticism, that Sextus Empiricus would be known for, and he would set out to defend. So in his Outlines of Pyrrhonism, early on, he gives us three possibilities on knowledge. Okay, so let's take a proposition and call it P. Just give it a variable, all right? So I can say that I have knowledge of proposition P if I can give justified reasons for believing in P. And so those who agree with that kind of hold to the first possibility of knowledge, which Sextus Empiricus calls the dogmatic approach. He calls these philosophers dogmatists. Okay, so Platonists, at least pre-skeptical Platonists, would fall in that category. The Aristotelians would fall in that category. The Stoics, and so on. Kind of you'd think of this as like the traditional or mainstream view of the philosophers, that knowledge is possible. And then the second two possibilities are skeptical possibilities. The second one is to say, for proposition P, it is not possible to achieve justification. And Sextus Empiricus calls this the academic position, okay, named after the academy, right? This is the position that the academy moved to eventually, which is to say we can only really know one thing, which is that knowledge is not possible. So they made a commitment. You might think of this as kind of an epistemological skepticism, is sort of defined by a commitment epistemologically that justification, sufficient reason for belief in P, is not possible. So eventually in Plato's Academy, there'd be a split. There was a split among skeptics, and there's a third group. So the third possibility, which is the Pyrrhonian approach to knowledge, is to say that for any proposition P, there will always be enough reasons to believe in it as there will be to oppose it. Okay, so kind of picture the proposition P, like let's just take the proposition that animals have souls, all right? So the Pyrrhonian position is to say that proposition lies sort of in the middle, as it were, between a perfect balance of two sides, right? For the proposition and against the proposition, that these two sides are equally balanced, such that you have no other option except to suspend your judgment, is the way the Pyrrhonians will talk about this, to suspend your judgment regarding the proposition that all animals have souls. Okay. So before we move the conversation back to Montaigne, and again, it's this third option, the Pyrrhonian option, that will be the one that's particularly attractive to Montaigne. We really have to look at two things that Sextus Empiricus believed characterized the Pyrrhonian position, beyond just saying that for any given proposition P, there's just as many reasons for as against. Okay, that might not seem obvious to you. There's always going to be just as many reasons for believing as opposing. That just doesn't, it seems like certain things would be more obviously true and other things less obvious, and so on, right? So it seems kind of odd to say something like that. So Sextus Empiricus makes this really interesting point about Pyrrhonian skepticism. He says this, that Pyrrhonian skepticism, unlike especially the dogmatist schools of thought, so Platonism or whatever, right? They believe that there actually are things that you can know. Like Platonists, for example, argue that ultimate reality is non-material. It's made up of these forms. Aristotle, disagrees with that and has a different view of the way form and matter kind of synthesize and work together. But they believe that these are things that you can know and sort of articulate and defend. And so in contrast to the dogmatists, as Sextus says. The Pyrrhonians do not hold, and I think he maybe puts the academic skeptics in that camp as well, right? Because they have made a commitment, and it's not a sustainable commitment. And I tend to agree with him here. I don't see how the academic skeptic position can hold because it's self-refuting, right? The position says that we can know one thing, that knowledge is not possible. But the problem with that is the second that you say you can know that you can't know, you are making a knowledge claim. And so you have to somehow justify that knowledge. So it sort of collapses. And academic skepticism doesn't really have a strong presence in Western thought the way Pyrrhonian skepticism does. It just kind of recurs at various points in the history of Western philosophy. You know, with Montaigne, it's going to recur again with David Hume and some others. So back to this really interesting characteristic. So Sextus Empiricus says what characterizes Pyrrhonism is not a set of beliefs or philosophical commitments that, you know, are, let's say, epistemological, right? I believe X or I believe Y, and these are like doctrines that we hold or something. But rather, it's a skill. To be a Pyrrhonian is not to have a certain set of beliefs, but to have a certain skill. And that skill is precisely the skill of being able to balance reasons for and against any given proposition. That's really interesting that the Pyrrhonian skeptic has this, and Socrates, again, you know, you kind of look back to Socrates, and in some of those early dialogues, it looks like Socrates is doing something like that, right? That for any given proposition, he's able to mount a counter argument that looks just as weighty, and it leaves his interlocutors in this sort of paralysis, right? That actually comes out specifically in the Meno, this sort of idea that, you know, this frustrating experience that Socrates' interlocutors have where they think they know something and then they end up in this kind of intellectual paralysis. They don't know where to go. So that's, you know, this sort of the skill of the Pyrrhonian is to accomplish that. Very interesting, right? The second characteristic of the Pyrrhonian is this idea of suspending judgment. The Pyrrhonian, he avoids making assertions. And Montaigne has his own really interesting interpretation of Pyrrhonism, which, again, we'll get to in the next episode. But one sort of part of that we need to remember is suspending judgment aligns very well with the Greek term skeptikos, which is where we get skeptic from. And the meaning of that term is something like disposed to investigate. So if you're a skeptic, you are someone who is disposed to search things out. So in other words, in addition to the skeptic being someone who has this skill of balancing reasons for and against any proposition, you are also someone who never quits, right? You're always searching things out. You're investigating. You don't settle on a position. It's always something of an open conversation. Right? You know, you don't set things down and then build on that, right? You know, everything is still an open conversation for the Pyrrhonian skeptic. So it's kind of it's a posture toward life. You know, Pyrrhonian skepticism ends up being a sort of philosophy about how to live. And I think that was particularly important to Montaigne. So Montaigne, as we can turn to him now, as he's reading Sextus Empiricus. Again, we're in the 1570s, and he's back home, and he's writing out his essays. I mentioned his, you know, well-known statement, "What do I know?" And he had it inscribed on, it's like a medal or medallion or something, and I believe it hung it around his neck. But one thing that's interesting is that's what it says on one side. On the other side, it says, "I abstain," which is essentially the Pyrrhonian idea of suspending judgment. So this is not just a philosophy that has this temporary appeal to Montaigne. This was something very personal to him. It meant something to him. He had a deep connection with what Sextus was saying. One of the interesting things about the story here, though, is that apparently he read Sextus Empiricus for a period of time, and then he left off and went to other things. All right. So we're heading now into sort of why was he reading Sextus Empiricus? What was his connection to this Pyrrhonian strain of skepticism? So one interpretation of this is that he had a sort of like a crisis of doubt. And that fits sort of well with his bouts with depression that we have mentioned, right? And it might just be during one of those bouts that he really struggled with doubts about all sorts of things. And that narrative, as it goes, he came to eventually and worked himself out of it and went on and wrote other essays and kind of left Sextus Empiricus behind. All right. And apparently Pascal had a similar sort of take on Montaigne. Pascal, it's hard to tell because, Pascal he'll bring up the skeptic, right? And it's pretty easy to think of Montaigne there. He's speaking directly to Montaigne, but it's not always obvious. It is true that for Pascal, he does think of skepticism as a temporary frame of mind that cannot be sustained. It's inherently temporary because it's unlivable. You simply can't live this way. And I'm sympathetic with Pascal on this. It's hard for me to see how you could live a truly Pyrrhonian life, right? And Pascal certainly knew Pyrrhonian skepticism. It was the most forceful form or expression of skepticism. And it has this appeal because the world was so turbulent in the late 1500s into the early 1600s. We're talking about religious wars. Europe was unsettled in virtually every place in its culture. And so, it has this kind of appeal to it. And I think that's part of what was appealing about Pyrrhonian skepticism to Montaigne. But I don't agree with this interpretation of Montaigne. I don't agree. Well, I agree with Pascal that skepticism just is inherently not sustainable. So we go back to Aristotle saying all people by nature desire to know. It's not going to be very satisfying to just accept that we'll never know, but we should just keep searching. It seems like we've got to settle on something just to kind of float along in life, always seeking and never really finding seems to be unappealing. And it certainly seems to be a difficult school of thought to sustain, which probably explains why Pyrrhonian skepticism, has these sort of moments in Western thought where it becomes viral, to put it in common terms, right? It becomes viral, becomes sort of, in vogue, and then it kind of dies off again. It's really hard for it to sustain itself. But nevertheless, I don't think Montaigne was reading Sextus Empiricus simply because he was in this sort of bout or having this crisis of doubt or something like that. I think Montaigne really does see in Sextus Empiricus and in the Pyrrhonian tradition something that is worth internalizing. He sees it as useful. So Montaigne, it's well known, was a real deep critic of scholasticism. Okay, and so I've mentioned scholasticism briefly in another episode. So coming out of the Middle Ages, we think of people like Thomas Aquinas as sort of the greatest of the scholastic thinkers. Really, they heavily emphasize reason, the ability of reason to understand the natural revelation of God. There, you can think of nature as one form of revelation or one form of truth, and then God through his church providing a second form of revelation, and that's where you get the sacraments and faith and so on. And so the scholastics really work this out in great detail with a lot of rigor. And Montaigne's not all that impressed. And of course, it's a Montaigne that's living in a world where even though it looks like the sun is moving across the sky, we're now saying that it's not moving at all. and that somehow the earth, which doesn't seem to be moving, is itself moving. It's a world that is really topsy-turvy. And there's a lot of conflict in every part of society. And for Montaigne, I think he sees knowledge as dangerous. I think he sees knowledge, or the presumption, I guess I should put it that way, right? The presumption to knowledge as really dangerous, which is part of what makes knowledge dangerous. We want to have it. Aristotle's right. We want to have it, but we got to have the right kind of relationship to it. We have to see something of our feebleness, our limitations, and so on. It's this part of Montaigne that, you know, as I started to say that, you know, you can see Pascal later on picking up on this and saying, you know, there is something here in Montaigne that seems to be important for Pascal. But Montaigne is really not interested in a kind of dogmatic overconfidence in reason that characterized scholasticism in his mind. This is exactly what gets us into trouble. And he would say the same thing about Martin Luther, right? And you think about Luther in his "Here I Stand" speech at the Diet of Worms, where he says, "Unless you can convince me with reason and the scriptures, I can do no other." And he's being asked to renounce his works, right? And he essentially says, "No, unless you can convince me." And it's this kind of overconfidence in what reason can do. Interestingly, Luther will have some things to say about reason that may surprise Montaigne. I'm not quite sure how deeply Montaigne paid attention to Luther, but in any case, this is what gets us into trouble for Montaigne. This is what causes divisiveness. And so this looks to me like Montaigne, he was a lifelong Roman Catholic. And it's often been thought that he sees in Pyrrhonian skepticism an important tool, a weapon of the Counter-Reformation, a defense of the tradition of the church. Now, how can skepticism be part of a defense of the tradition of the church? I'll take that up in his apology for Raymond Sebon. Before we conclude, let me draw one interesting similarity between Montaigne and Socrates. Socrates, like Montaigne, lived in a turbulent world. The philosophical activity of Socrates, at least most of it, occurred against the backdrop of war. Athens found itself in a 27-year war with Sparta. Began in 431 BC, lasted until 404 BC. That's when Socrates was active. And so this war, the work of Thucydides, called the Peloponnesian War, is a magnificent book. It's large, but it is worth reading if you're interested in not just war and in history, but it really is a work of political thought. And in that work, you see Athens going off the rails. Mob rule takes over in Athens, known for its democracy, right? Known for its assembly and the city of freedom that gives power to its people to make decisions for its future. It goes off the rails into a kind of mob rule and a sort of political chaos. And Socrates was right there in the middle of all this. Plato was growing up in Athens during all of this. So that's a point that's often overlooked, I think, by philosophers, is to understand that Socrates is not just somebody who is philosophically interested in some sort of abstract way. He sees the movements of power clashing in all sorts of ways as results of dangerous attitudes toward knowledge, presumption. And I think Montaigne sees something similar in his own time. Many presuming to know, but not knowing. A skeptical exercise, the Pyrrhonian skill of balancing reasons for and reasons against proposition P. I think Montaigne sees that as precisely the sort of healthy intellectual attitude that we ought to cultivate. So, when Aristotle said that all men by nature desire to know, he was describing human beings. He was saying this is something we can know. We can know that all people desire to know. It's evident to us. He's the great philosopher of common sense, and the world lends itself to our intuition. Aristotle saw no difficulty in thinking the sun moved across the sky, for example. But times had changed. Montaigne's world was full of uncertainty. We can't even trust our senses when it comes to the way the world works. What do we know? For Montaigne, this is not resignation. This is a challenge to always strive to know and yet never assume that we do. And in that, he's hoping for a better response to turbulent times. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Our question is to think or not to think. Bye for now.